So, along with the list of stupid things to do during a pandemic, this would probably be on the list. So, it was last May. My son had just graduated from college, and he decided he was going to take part in a recovery mission to the Virgin Islands to help people whose boats were there stranded make them back, during COVID, before hurricane season hit, which also meant taking 2 flights. And I don't know if you remember last May, but it was like cases were rising, hospitalizations, deaths were rising, and most everyone had quit flying except in Florida, right? No, Florida, the planes were packed. So I'm thinking, really, you're going to get on a flight, you're going to fly to Miami, then you're flying to the Virgin Islands, you get there. What if you've contracted it? Then there's a couple of days messing with the boat before you get on the boat and you go 12, 14 days at sea. You can't stop. That's the whole reason for the mission, because Puerto Rico, the Bahamas, Haiti, everything was closed. So once you set sail, you're committed. I'm like, this sounds like a really bad idea. And then, they're trying to beat hurricane season, and there are things called pirates, and then they didn't know the people, right? There's some wealthy gentleman who owns the boat, and then there was a young woman stranded who'd never sailed but always thought it would be neat. And then, of course, there's always the really good friend who someone knows who shows up with the ankle bracelet on and that kind of thing. So I'm just like, none of this sounds good to me. And, of course, there was no talking him out of it, right? So it was like 12, 14 frightening days for me amidst everything else chaotic going on. The disciples are always kind of like thrown out there as thick-headed and stupid, and especially in Mark's gospel, but they at least have like the wherewithal to be afraid of the storm, right? They're like afraid, and for good reason. They lived very frightening lives. They lived in a time where the Roman Empire was crushing them. They say that the average peasant would have a calorie intake of 300 to 500 calories a day. People didn't have a lot. A bad harvest could literally wipe you out. And so in this passage, the sea represents the chaos and the fear. And, we can think of our own things like that, our own cancers and addictions and oppression, depression. We think of voter suppression, all the kinds of turmoil situations we have. And so in that moment, the disciples call out for Jesus, and he shows up, wakes up, peace be still, and all of a sudden there is this great calm. And most of us have had a moment like that in our life, right? When you find out that, the doctor had said 2 years and it's been 10. Or everyone's heard of somebody who the scan can't find the tumor, right? Or, literally overnight, Juneteenth. I mean, those moments where the Berlin Wall comes down and there's seemingly a miracle. And yet that's not where we live most days, right? I mean, most days we live in, who has heard a story about Syria lately? You don't really want to look at any of the stories. 10 years into that civil war, it's devastating. Or like, how far away are the Palestinians and the Israelis from a 2-state solution, right? And it is voter suppression going across this country like nobody's business. And if I hear one more person who's been diagnosed with a terminal cancer, right? It's the family who just lost their second of 3 children. So it's like there is this really difficult place. So we have Jesus, the miracle worker, and we have those moments when we experience that, but we also have the reality that we often live in very stormy times, rough waters, that we seem somewhat powerless to do anything about. So this passage, though, has a couple of other interesting nuggets in there that people skip over. In Mark's gospel, they're getting on the boat, and then there's that line, other boats were with them. Matthew and Luke dropped that for some reason, and a lot of scholars say it's just kind of a throwaway line. Let me tell you, those people never had their son out in the middle of the water for 14 days, because the other boats that are with you, that's not something to sneer at. Because as it turned out, 280 boats needed to get home, and Salty Dog Sailing Association decided to provide free satellite coverage and free guidance and free direction and organized flotillas so that they'd set out in groups of 50, right? Now, to be honest, Ben was like, yeah, it was pretty dark late at night. We couldn't really, they're far away. I don't know. But you want those other boats with you, right? And as it comes along, there's this other line in there too. And Jesus is with them. Mark's going to have another passage 2 chapters later where they're in the boat and then the storm comes up and Jesus comes walking across the water. So there's In the sea stories, there's some where the rescue comes from outside the boat, but there's a lot when it's inside the boat. So it's like, who do you have traveling with you, right? I mean, we all know this. We've all heard this a gazillion times. You got to be traveling with people and surround yourself and get people in your boat who can nurture you and offer stability. I mean, what did you see that Washington Post article this week that like 38% of Americans don't know one person they can rely on? I mean, there's the loneliness, right? So how do we figure out a way to bring people in and be encouraging and be an offer of stability? So Annette Gordon-Reed knows a little bit about growing up in stormy times. She teaches at Harvard now, but she wrote a book called On Juneteenth, kind of a simple, small memoir. And she grew up in Texas, like me, a couple years older. She was in East Texas. I was more in North Central Texas. But the Texas she grew up in, the same, her memories are different. So I remember the first black girl in the class, and she was the first black girl in the class. And in her memoir, she describes what it was like to grow up the descendant of slaves in East Texas, what it was like to be the first kid to integrate the class. She remembers too, like the doctor's waiting office and the white entrance and the colored entrance. And she could see through the receptionist's desk into the waiting room, the white waiting room. And not that it was just roomier and nicer, but the magazine rack had a lot more magazines on it. And she remembered as a little girl who loved to read, just thinking, how unfair is that? And then of course there were the balconies where they sat during the movies and the shops that wouldn't welcome her. But mainly it was that experience of integrating the school that really shaped her existence. It wasn't a popular decision among the whites in Conroe. And it really wasn't a completely popular decision among the blacks in Conroe either, because some folks saw it as a rejection of the black school, as if it was a way of saying, what's wrong with Booker T. Washington? It's a good school. And her parents, though, kind of disagreed with the K through 12. They knew the black kids were all crammed into one school. And the school books, my mother's talked about that, tattered, hand-me-down, buildings dilapidated. But it was complicated. Her mother taught in that school. It was an excellent school. And like many other of the litigate, of the people who were represented by Brown versus Board in many of the cases, many black folks objected to the idea that schools were inherently unequal because the teachers, the black teachers, were so amazing. And I just hadn't really thought until I read her memoir about how stable, how much a boat, how much a source of stability the black school was in the community. Like she said, a lot of times your teacher would also be your neighbor, your Sunday school teacher, your relative. The whole neighborhood really became the school. Your teacher could see if you were like jumping rope when you really could have been inside doing your lessons. And so she talks about when the schools were integrated, which I hadn't really thought about from this angle. I've read quite a bit about it, but not so much from the teacher's angle, that the intention was never to integrate the teaching force, right? No, the black teachers just lost their job, generally speaking, or were demoted. So I was looking it up in the years right after Brown and really right after the integration began, which was more in the 60s in Texas, 38,000 black teachers lost their job. I mean, that's a lot. We talked about Tulsa and the wealth that was up, 38,000 teachers. Even if it was a small pension, right? I mean, that's just unbelievable. But it's not just that, black kids were then taught by teachers who were well-meaning and loving. She said her teachers at the new school, were good, but they didn't know her context. They didn't know her. They didn't have a sense like the black teachers in the black school that this is a mission, right, that we're trying to educate. And then you think, not to make it all about me, but I was in graduate school before I had a black teacher. I mean, that is a travesty. And I bet most of us in this room, right? And you look at where we are right now, and you're no surprise. We could be 60 years further down the road, right? School boards, my husband's a school board attorney. Oh my gosh, school boards dig their heels in, right? And they keep a lot of positive change from happening still, right, to this day. So there's that whole, how do we understand and acknowledge? And so I've just been thinking, reading Annette's work, how tricky it would have been for the parents of the students, right? That they were really powerless to calm the storm, weren't they? I mean, in a country, Emmett Till and lynchings, in a country where you could burn a community, in a country where you could deny soldiers GI Bills for the color of their skin. I mean, the parents didn't have the power really to calm the storm, but what they did was what we see Jesus doing. It's extending the land. It's making a safe place. It's making a place where people can be, where people have some toehold, where people have some stability. I think about it when I run in the morning. There's one woman asleep in the park, and I've been a runner in this city for 40 years, and I volunteer with the homeless every Monday. She's different from anyone I've ever seen in her youth and kind of in her simple beauty. And she's vulnerable. She's so vulnerable there in the park, and she's not with it. And I noticed, though, people bringing her every morning fresh clothes and fresh food. And anybody who's worked with that population knows how tricky it is to calm the storm, the mental illness. We know how low the resources we have are, right? And sometimes what we can do is extend the land, right? Is offer a little bit of firmness. And I've been thinking about our dads, right? Last week we talked about expectations, how some of the family estrangement right now is because of our expectations, right? We think our parents should be able to solve everything. You know, and what does it mean to kind of shift from thinking dad can calm the storm to a dad can extend the land, right? And that's what we can all do. That's what we can do with our friends with cancer too, right? Like we can't, as much as we might want, take it away. But what is the way that we can be a source of comfort and nurture and care? So before Juneteenth becomes one more day to get a good deal on a mattress, it might be a nice opportunity to stop and think, to educate ourselves a little bit about, the strength and the stamina, right? People who got up every day and as proudly as they could tried to extend the land in a very stormy country. So may this sweet day, when we celebrate all of those who have nurtured us, those in our own homes and those in our broader community, may be a time too when we seek to find ways that we can extend that love, that stability, that care to all. Amen.